She thought it was just another cold morning behind the clinic, until she heard that growl. What Dr. Nora Whitlock found crouched in the dumpster wasn't just a wounded bobcat. It was a desperate mother, clinging to life for the sake of her unborn kittens. What followed was a journey of risk, compassion, and wild resilience. Stay with us to the end, because this is a story that will change how you see the quiet ones fighting to survive. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from in the comments. If you enjoy the story, please like and follow. It helps us keep creating more. Your feedback means everything. Thank you. The cold cut through her like a blade. Dr. Nora Whitlock pulled her lab coat tighter as she stepped out the back door of Pine Ridge Veterinary Clinic, the metal handle icy beneath her fingers. Snow crunched under her boots with each step toward the dumpsters, the only sound in the still, pre-dawn air of Fernwood, Vermont. She should have worn her winter parka, but she hadn't expected the wind to bite this sharply before sunrise. It was garbage day, her least favorite part of the morning routine. The sky overhead was an endless black blue, stars fading slowly. Her breath billowed out in clouds, vanishing into the darkness. She heaved the first garbage bag into the bin, the plastic rustling loudly in the quiet. That's when she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. It wasn't a rustling raccoon or the squeak of a dumpster lid. It was low, guttural, a growl, rough, dry, and unmistakably wild. She froze. The hairs on her arms stood up beneath her sleeves. Her fingers hovered over the second bag, unmoving. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket for her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam wavered slightly as she lifted it. "Hello?" she said quietly, heart pounding. Foolish, as if whatever growled would politely respond. She stepped closer to the dumpster, angling the light toward the sound. The beam caught a glint. Eyes, wide, golden, and glowing back at her. She drew a sharp breath. Curled in a crouch beside the torn garbage bags was a wild bobcat, large, emaciated. Its fur was patchy, matted with dirt, and something darker. Blood. One front leg was tucked awkwardly beneath it. The animal didn't flinch under the light. It didn't run. It didn't even snarl. It just stared at her, panting quietly, its breath fogging in the cold. Nora's training surged forward. This wasn't a territorial animal defending its turf. This was something else entirely. Something wounded, starved, and possibly dying. "You poor thing," she whispered, crouching slightly. The bobcat's ribs were visible even through its winter coat. Its jaw parted slightly, releasing a weak growl, more air than sound. But there was no strength in it. A healthy bobcat would never be caught near a human, let alone a dumpster behind a clinic. Something had driven this animal here. Desperation. Nora stood slowly and backed away. "Stay right there," she murmured, though she knew the animal likely couldn't go anywhere fast. Inside the clinic, she moved on instinct. Heavy-duty gloves, a thick fleece blanket, a sedative syringe, a reinforced crate. Her hands didn't tremble. Years of emergencies had prepared her for adrenaline-laced moments like this, but still, her breath was shallow with nerves as she returned to the alley. The bobcat hadn't moved. She crouched low, speaking softly as she approached. "Easy, girl. Or boy. I'm here to help." She held the blanket wide and gently draped it over the cat's head and shoulders. The animal shuddered but didn't resist. Nora slid the injector pole in place and administered the sedative. Within minutes, the bobcat's breathing slowed. She maneuvered its body into the crate as gently as possible. It was lighter than it should have been. Too light. Back in the treatment room, she worked quickly. Fluids. Temperature. Pain check. She trimmed the fur near the leg wound. Deep, inflamed, possibly infected. But it was when she began palpating the abdomen that she froze. A shape. Then another. Nora blinked, repositioned her hands, pressed gently. A fullness that made no sense on an animal this underweight. She turned to the ultrasound machine. As the black and white screen flickered to life, her eyes widened. 3 distinct shapes. Tiny pulses of life. Movement. "Oh," she breathed. "You're not a he at all, are you?" The bobcat was female, and she was pregnant. The cold had driven her to garbage for survival, not for herself, Nora realized, but for her unborn kittens. And now, their lives were in her hands. The truck rumbled into the gravel lot just after noon. Nora was finishing a round of vaccinations when she saw the familiar silver Tacoma pull up outside the clinic's back entrance. Garrett Boone stepped out, shoulders hunched slightly against the cold, a wool hat pulled low over his forehead. He looked just as she remembered, broad frame, weathered hands, and an air of quiet steadiness that never seemed rushed, no matter the emergency. "She's inside," Nora said as she opened the rear door for him. Still sedated, barely moved. Garrett gave a short nod, lifting a plastic crate lined with straw from the truck bed. "You said pregnant?" he asked, voice low and rough from years of speaking only when necessary. 3 kittens on ultrasound, maybe more. They moved swiftly and silently. Together, they transferred the bobcat, still groggy but breathing steadily, into the transport crate. Nora had bundled her in thick towels and a thermal pad, her injured leg stabilized. As they secured the door, Garrett paused to look inside. "She didn't try to escape?" Nora shook her head. "She just stared at me, like she was too tired to care." Garrett grunted, not in disbelief, but understanding. "She's a fighter, though. She made it this far." They drove together in Garrett's truck, snow swirling in soft bursts across the windshield. The road wound through dense forest toward his rehabilitation facility, an old barn converted into an animal care center, nestled at the edge of a state-protected woodland preserve. Inside the heated intake room, Garrett and Nora settled the bobcat into an isolated enclosure lined with pine straw and dim lighting. Nora watched as the animal stirred, her golden eyes fluttering open. She didn't panic. She simply curled tighter, breathing slow and labored. "She's not wild in spirit," Nora said softly. Garrett crossed his arms. "She's wild, just exhausted." He crouched near the crate and studied the feline through the mesh. "She stayed, didn't run. That means something. I'm calling her Lark." "Lark?" Nora raised an eyebrow. He gave a faint smile. "They say larks sing just before dawn, even when it's still dark. Seems fitting." For the next hour, they ran gentle assessments, temperature, hydration, wound checks. Lark allowed it all with surprising stillness, watching them with cautious but clear eyes. Garrett confirmed what Nora had feared. She was dangerously malnourished, anemic, and likely dehydrated for days. Her body wasn't ready to give birth, but time wasn't waiting. "Odds?" Nora asked quietly. Garrett didn't answer right away. "She's on a wire," he said at last. "The kittens might be fine. Or not. It depends on whether her system holds up in the next few days." "I want to help," Nora said without hesitation. "Mornings, evenings, whatever you need." He studied her for a moment. Most vets would have called Fish and Wildlife and moved on. She looked down at her gloves. "She came to me. I can't walk away from that." From that evening on, Nora made 2 visits a day, before sunrise and after closing the clinic. Each time, she'd bring fresh meat, check the heat settings, administer fluids or antibiotics if needed. But mostly, she'd sit quietly just outside Lark's enclosure, watching. There was something grounding in those moments. The forest beyond the barn was silent. Lark rarely moved, but her eyes never stopped watching Nora. Not in fear, something else. A silent recognition. 2 nights later, Garrett met Nora at the gate, expression tense. Her body temperature dropped this afternoon. She's been making a nest all evening. Restless. Nora felt her breath hitch. You think it's starting? I do. They entered the observation cabin and watched through the live feed. Lark had arranged the straw into a tight circle inside the den box. Her breathing was shallow. Her muscles twitched with contractions. Should we go in? Nora asked. Not unless it turns bad, Garrett replied. She has to do this on her own. For hours, they sat side by side in the quiet hum of monitors, and then, just after 2 a.m., a flicker of movement. A tiny, damp kitten slid into the nest. Lark immediately turned, licking it clean, coaxing breath into its fragile lungs. Another came 40 minutes later. Then another. 3 in total. Nora watched with wide eyes, a lump rising in her throat. Lark, weak and wounded, was now a mother, strong and sure. She did it, she whispered. Garrett nodded, eyes still on the screen. The forest hasn't lost her yet. Winter deepened, and so did the silence. Snow piled thick on the roof of Garrett's barn, blanketing the world in white stillness. Inside, the air was warm and laced with the faint scent of pine straw and heating coils. Lark lay curled around her 3 kittens, their tiny bodies pressed against her for warmth and sustenance. Nora visited every morning before the clinic opened. She'd arrive just before dawn, boots crunching across the frozen path, breath forming clouds in the pale light. By now, the routine was instinctive. Check the camera feed, prepare a small tray of fresh rabbit meat, log temperatures, refill the water dish, administer medication if needed. But she always lingered afterward. In those quiet minutes, she'd sit on a low wooden bench outside the enclosure, watching through the mesh as Lark groomed her young. There was something sacred in the way the wild cat mother moved, delicate, deliberate, powerful even in exhaustion. And always, those golden eyes watching Nora in return. The kittens grew quickly. At 9 days, their eyes opened, cloudy blue at first, blinking at the world. One was bold, crawling over Lark's side and batting at shadows. One was cautious, sticking close to her belly. The third was curious, frequently trying to climb the walls of the enclosure or paw at the heat lamp above. They're strong, Garrett said one morning, peering over Nora's shoulder. Better than I expected, considering how close we were to losing all of them. Because of her, Nora replied softly. She never gave up, even when her body should have. Garrett gave a short nod but didn't speak further. He didn't need to. Every glance toward the enclosure was a quiet testament to respect. By early February, Lark was standing more often, stretching slowly, limping slightly on her healing leg. Her fur had grown back in soft waves over the scarred area. Her coat was thicker now, more vibrant. She moved differently, not just physically stronger, but more confident. Garrett began introducing enrichment activities, soft toys, scent trails, a rolling ball of fur to mimic prey. Nora laughed one evening when the curious kitten pounced and fell headfirst into the water dish, shaking droplets off its nose like an annoyed house cat. I think that one's got trouble in her future, she joked. "I think that one's going to be a survivor," Garrett replied, a rare smile tugging at his mouth. Not everything was easy. There were scares. One night, the cautious kitten wouldn't nurse, and Nora stayed past midnight, pacing and reviewing her notes until it finally latched on again. Another time, Lark refused food for a full day. But each crisis passed. Each test was weathered. Nora's connection to them deepened. Not a pet owner bond, not even maternal, but something quieter, a kind of reverence. She never touched the kittens. She rarely spoke when near them, but they had become a part of her rhythm. Their survival anchored her in a season where the world often felt too cold. She sometimes wondered why Lark hadn't run that morning behind the clinic, why she hadn't disappeared into the trees, even half dead, why she had chosen Nora's dumpster. And maybe it wasn't choosing, not really. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was the whisper of something else, something wordless between species. In March, as the snow began to thin and the sun lingered longer, Garrett called a meeting. "They're weaning. Lark's hunting instincts are returning. We'll start preparation for release," he said. Nora felt her chest tighten. She had known this was the goal. She had worked for it, hoped for it. But the idea of letting them go, of walking away from what had become her daily purpose, stung deeper than she expected. "They'll be ready?" she asked. "They're born to be," Garrett answered simply. Outside, the trees groaned under melting ice. Somewhere beyond the snowbanks and pine trunks, a future waited. And so, as winter melted into spring, so did Nora's hold on the little family she had helped save. The road was quiet as they drove north. A light drizzle had replaced the Vermont snow, and the world shimmered with early spring melt. Buds were beginning to swell on the trees, and the air held that unmistakable scent of damp earth and awakening growth. In the back of Garrett's truck, secured in a reinforced transport crate, Lark and her kittens lay nestled together, alert but calm. Nora sat beside the crate, one gloved hand resting lightly on the metal top, not touching, just close enough to feel connected. The crate's mesh window revealed Lark's golden eyes, wide and steady. She hadn't needed sedation, not this time. Somehow, she seemed to understand. The release site was part of a protected wilderness corridor nearly 100 miles from Fernwood. Remote, safe, miles from the nearest human dwelling. Garrett had worked with the State Conservation Office to secure the location: dense pine forest, abundant prey, and no territorial males nearby. When they arrived, a conservation officer named Jonah helped unload the crate. He moved quietly, respectfully, as if they were entering sacred ground. And in a way, they were. The clearing was carpeted with moss and damp leaves. The truck was parked at the edge of the tree line. Beyond that, the forest stretched endlessly, untouched, alive. Garrett glanced at Nora. "You should be the one to open it." Nora hesitated. She hadn't expected that. Her hands moved slowly as she approached the crate's latch. She crouched, meeting Lark's gaze through the mesh. "You're going home," she whispered. She flipped the latch and stepped back. For a long moment, nothing happened. The clearing held its breath. Then, Lark emerged. She stepped out cautiously, her powerful shoulders rippling beneath her now glossy coat. She paused, nostrils flaring, taking in the sense of her new territory. Every movement was graceful, deliberate, wild. Behind her, 3 pairs of eyes peered from the crate. The curious one was first, bounding out and tripping over a tree root with comic enthusiasm. The cautious one crept slowly behind. The bold one leapt free in a single, confident bound. Lark watched them, then gave a low, inaudible chuff, Some unspoken cue. The kittens turned toward her, their little bodies weaving through the underbrush, tails twitching. She led them to the edge of the clearing, pausing once. Just once. She turned her head, and for the briefest moment, her eyes met Nora's. There was no fear in them, no plea, just recognition, a silent echo of trust. Then she turned away, and the forest took them back. Nora stood frozen, heart tight in her chest. The underbrush rustled for a few moments longer, then fell still. They were gone. Jonah spoke first. "That's a rare thing. Most don't look back." Garrett nodded. "She's not most." They packed up the crate in silence. Nora's hands moved automatically, but her mind was far away, somewhere in the trees. "She wouldn't have made it without you," Garrett said as they reached the truck. "None of them would have." Nora didn't answer. She just looked out toward the forest. She hadn't expected it to feel like loss, but it did. A quiet ache, a letting go. Back at the clinic the next morning, there was a small box waiting on her desk. Inside was a printed photo, grainy but clear, from the rehab center's night camera. Lark curled around her 3 kittens just minutes after giving birth. They were so small, eyes closed, pressed tight against her. There was a note tucked beneath the frame. Garrett's handwriting, brief as always. "For the ones who come back stronger. G." Nora stared at the photo for a long moment, then set it on the shelf above her desk, beside a jar of pens and an old anatomy textbook. The image didn't make her sad, not anymore, because somewhere out there, a mother and her 3 wild children were alive, thriving, and that was more than enough. The days grew longer. Fernwood thawed. By April's end, crocuses poked up through damp soil, and robins returned to the clinic's back lot. Life moved forward in its quiet, ordinary rhythm. Vaccinations, checkups, spay appointments. But something had shifted in Nora. She still woke early, still walked the familiar path to her truck every dawn. But without the urgency of Lark's care, her mornings felt lighter and emptier. The photo on her desk remained, a quiet sentinel above her computer monitor. Every time she glanced at it, it reminded her that not all rescues were meant to stay, that sometimes the best outcome meant goodbye. One drizzly morning in May, Nora was reviewing lab results when Lisa, the vet tech, knocked on her office door. "There's someone out front," she said, voice uncertain. "She found a raccoon kit on the side of the road, thinks it might be orphaned." Nora rose without hesitation, lab coat swaying as she followed Lisa down the hall. At the front desk stood a woman in a rain jacket, hair damp, holding a towel-wrapped bundle. "I didn't know where else to go," the woman said, her voice tight with worry. "It was just lying there, all alone." Nora reached out gently, parting the folds of the towel. Inside was a tiny raccoon, its eyes still sealed, fur damp from the rain. It let out a thin, helpless squeak. "It's okay," Nora said softly. "You did the right thing." She cradled the kit in her gloved hands, already assessing its condition by touch. Cold, dehydrated, underweight, but alive. And suddenly, she felt it again, that familiar jolt of purpose. The same quiet fire that had stirred the morning she met Lark behind the dumpster. The unshakable pull to help something fragile survive. Later that afternoon, after stabilizing the raccoon and arranging a transfer to a licensed rehabber, Nora found herself in her office, filling out the intake log. Rain tapped softly against the windows. She paused, glancing at the photo again. Lark and her kittens nestled in warmth. It wasn't about the rarity of the bobcat or the drama of the rescue. It was about this, the ongoing, unglamorous truth that somewhere, always, something small and voiceless needed someone to care. That night, she called Garrett, just to check in. "Got a fox kit last week," he told her. Eyes open, eating on his own. Bit of an attitude already. She smiled. "Sounds like trouble." "You'd like him." There was a pause. "And Lark?" she asked. "No collar, no camera. But I did find tracks up near the creek bed last week. Adult and 3 juveniles, still together." Nora's chest swelled. "Good." "They're doing what they're meant to do," Garrett said, "living wild." When the call ended, Nora sat back in her chair, listening to the soft hum of the clinic's hallway. Outside, dusk was falling, and the streetlights were flickering on. A knock came at the back door. She rose and opened it to the silhouette of a local farmer she recognized. He was holding a small crate with something furry inside. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "Think I've got a barn owl with a busted wing." Nora smiled. "Come on in, let's take a look." She stepped aside, holding the door open. The warmth of the clinic spilled into the night. Somewhere deep in the forest, a bobcat mother was teaching her young how to stalk, how to survive. But here, under fluorescent lights and antiseptic air, another life had just arrived needing help. And that, Nora thought, was the point. Lark hadn't just survived. She had reminded Nora why she did this work, why it mattered, why she would always open the door, even on the coldest, darkest days. Because the wild didn't knock. But it still came. And someone had to answer.